Welcome. Good afternoon. And thank you for coming to this Hive seminar, where we're going to talk about open publishing. And without any real further introduction to that, I'm just going to introduce the speakers. They've been asked to speak for about 20 minutes each. I think we'll do a few brief questions following each speaker, and then have a more open discussion following that. And the first speaker is Andrew Lockett, who's the
press manager.
Press manager, yes, the press manager of the University of Westminster Press. He has a long background in publishing, including being the reference director for the Rough Guide and publishing director at Gerald Duckworth, and also before that as head of book publishing at the British Film Industry Institute, and with roles at Prune, Howell, Northridge, and Oxford University Press. And he's here to talk about open publishing, a long revolution.
Okay, I'll just briefly start by explaining our logo and the title. The logo of the University of Westminster Press is just in case you haven't figured it out, it's an open laptop and an open book, which is trying to kind of combine what we're trying to do, so print and digital. And along evolution, there is a sort of half Raymond Williams reference there, but I'll carry on to the next slide. So, the University of Westminster Press is a new university press. It's an open access university press, and what I'm going to start with really is talking about, after a little bit about the press itself, of the kind of what's been happening in the last sort of 18 months in terms of open access publishing, new university presses and academic publishing. So the University of Westminster Press was instigated, the initiative of the Westminster's Deputy VC for Research and the library. And the library are currently our sort of funding vehicle they support us in terms of the publications that we undertake. We are part of a small research and scholarly communications department. This is maybe slightly unusual for one of the new university presses, which are mostly based on libraries, or based within libraries, I should say. So we publish in all key forms of digital. So that's print on, EPUB, MOBI, and PDF. MOBI being the Amazon format, plus print on demand and print books in the normal sense. Our journals are digital only, and our focus is humanities and social sciences. Like most university presses, that is the general norm. Getting more specific, these are the subjects that we've commissioned and contract titles in. So social media studies is our big sort of flagship area. There's the cultural industries, modern history, critical legal studies, and popular music is another thing that we are expecting to publish around. We have two journals, both online, again, I'm repeating myself here. Humanities and social sciences are the two sort of areas relative to many others which are showing the most enthusiasm for open access publishing, and particularly in books. University of Westminster Press is a micro press of a kind that seems to be on the rise. I put in precariously because, with one exception, one notable exception, that these presses are really quite small. So, University Westminster Press is 0.8 FTE, which means that it's just me. Plus, we work with a platform provider called Ubiquity Press, and they do a lot of the sort of production end of things and the technical stuff. And if you'd like to learn a little bit more, he said, plugging his article, there is a sort of piece I did with Laura Spiker of the University of College London Press, which explains in a little why in the last 18 months or so we've seen university presses starting up again in the UK, a new wave of those. So the impetus for this new wave has come from libraries in the UK and worldwide. That's the strongest push. There have been other factors like research, the development of research and ref, and academics simply getting kind of frustrated with the status quo. So, a bit of my jargon, NUPs is New University Presses, and these UK university presses that have started up are populated by a sort of relatively equal mix of librarians getting into publishing, publishers getting into the area of scholarly communications, and academics who've also taken the kind of lead. I think you could even argue the academics were there first, because there were academic open access presses well before the universities came into the picture. And so here are the new ones: Cardiff University Press, UCL the largest, Huddersfield technically the oldest, UWP, White Rose, which is a consortium of Yorkshire universities, Leeds, Sheffield, York. Goldsmiths, I put them a little aside because I've been characterising all this movement as open access, and Sarah's going to expound a little bit on that and give a bit more nuance. And the only thing that's happened in the last sort of 4 or 5 months is we've seen the Policy Press, which is not an open access press. I don't know if it's planning to become one, beginning to morph into Bristol University Press. They've been an entity for quite a long time, quite successful in their area, and the university is now bringing them into what they hope will be a warm embrace. A recent study been undertaken by JISC, who've questionnaire all universities in the UK, estimates that maybe a further 12 universities in the UK considering becoming or undertaking a university press. And the estimate they've given is that by 2020 the numbers could have gone up to 17 to 29. I think that's a bit ambitious, my instinct. We'll see. But one thing I would say is there are more university presses than you think. Myself and a couple of colleagues in the sector were playing the game of, how many university presses there are in the UK, and actually we keep finding new ones. It was a bit like Jordan's tree frog, thought to be extinct for 100 years, and lo and behold, there's a university press, and I won't embarrass the universities by saying where, but at a place we didn't think there was one, because it was very low key or very, let's say, maybe not search engine optimized or something. So there are more than you would think, and there was a lot more activity going on than you would think in the area of both publishing, open access, and otherwise. So what was the rationales behind these? I'd say there's obviously a degree of altruism in terms of open access evangelism and wanting to enable research to be made available for free. There's certainly the case in Westminster. There was the impetus of wanting to stimulate research culture. So if the university press is on the doorstep, the idea is that it becomes easier to publish works in the sense that you have someone nearby that you can work with a bit more closely than someone in an office in the middle of America. There's also the impetus to undertake an innovation, which Sarah will talk about. Boosting the parent brand. Yes, it is at a certain level considered in some places to a greater or lesser degree as a marketing exercise, which may impact on recruitment of MA or graduate students. Local and global engagements. It's very good. University presses have long had a tradition of being locally engaged. Now there is, with the University of Westminster, it so turns out has an outpost in Tashkent, Uzbekistan, and I don't think we're unusual. There's quite a lot of global engagement going on, and the digital world is a great way to do that. And then there is the argument about setting up a university press which relates to RAF profile and a return in 2020 or 2021. Graham Stone, formerly of the University of Huddersfield, now of JISC, has undertaken a measuring exercise which tries to correlate the publications undertaken at Huddersfield, which would otherwise not have taken place with the money received from RAF, and he's come up with an answer to say that the investment the universities put in is earned back, if you like, through RAF returns. It's a tiny bit questionable, that, but I can see that there is a logic, and UCL Press is certainly publishing a lot of their authors on the basis of expecting that to be a positive step for them in RAF, and they do quite specialist things, including things like books on early Dutch football, which, if you know anything about football, Dutch football didn't get too exciting until about the 70s. Anyway, but one of the big motivators, and one shouldn't underestimate it, is frustration with the current publishing environment, scholarly communications environment. And so, I think in two cases I can mention that there was just a feeling that we'll just do it. We will go ahead and, we will go and become a publisher because that's what we feel we need to do. Now, there are lots of precedents, lots of structures around scholarly publishing, and quite a lot going on in other sorts of ways. So a university press is not the only way, if you like, to move forward or become open access or to undertake activity. There are numerous academic collective publishers. I mentioned the Open Humanities Press that have been around for a long time. Certainly should be familiar on this campus. There's a new press called Mattering, which is focusing on society and technology. And there's the Open Book Publishers, which is based in Cambridge and does a lot in humanities and some social sciences. The Open Library of Humanities is a venture which undertakes to publish for, without author processing charges, a lot of articles in a various number of fields, and they are supported by a huge grant from Andrew Mellon. But this is to kind of get around the block of various kinds that exist with existing journal publishing. Other ways of characterising the activity, there are what you would call branded university presses. So we've got our logo, and other people certainly have their surround. What I've called brown bag library publishing initiatives. So kind of no marketing, no major push, just the undertaking to support open journal systems, journals. Sort of ground level publishing completely without frills, but it goes on, and you'd be surprised how much of there is across the world, particularly in an area like media. It is really and humanities. It's really surprising to see how much of that there is. And then, more formally, the Library Publishing Coalition in the US is a group of librarian publishers, very large group. They have an annual conference. And then there are other organisations that I mentioned there. I'm going to struggle to remember exactly what they stand for. I have a guess. Access Publishers in Europe Network and the European. No, I'm going to give up on the second one. I only discovered that one yesterday. There are also things like multi-institutional presses. So actually, university and the press are not the only model. There is the Lever Press, which is a group of US liberal arts colleges that have got together to share sort of infrastructure and framework, and the White Rose University Press, which has gathered together those three northern universities to undertake activity. And overseas, there's a lot going on, and you have in Canada and Australia. I don't want to say that open access is a dominant way of publishing there, but it would be interesting to kind of take a measure. Australian National University Press has been going for a long time, very successful. And Europe, there are a lot of minority languages where they have open access or university press publishing. And I have to say, I think necessity can indeed be the mother of invention, in the sense that if you are a country with a population of, I don't know, 8 million or something like that, I think you are more or less forced to publish in sort of open access or format, or either that or to become the national monopoly supplier, which is a route taken by Slovenians. But it is the case that without the big global English language market, and the problem is it's not that big anymore in terms of people who are prepared to pay or are able to pay for scholarly research, then then you have to kind of come to a DIY approach. So there is some kind of wider context on why open access and what's been going on. There's a lot of debate about this. So we've heard a lot about the monograph crisis, the Crossett report. I think there are actually potentially 3 different elements interweaving here in terms of what's going on. There's the issue of library budgets, just continually kind of reducing, getting cut. And journals publishing taking over what used to be allocated for books, and it doesn't tend to get better every year. There's rising access to publication outlets. There is a perception that it's difficult to publish, which I think it certainly is in some areas. Early career researchers in particular, or those in working in areas that are not considered very commercial. Other people say, well, there are more books published than ever by academics, so what's the crisis? I think one of the underlying issues is also a kind of absence of readers, is that most people are really struggling to find the time to do research, to read, and so on. And that's also, I think, something a problem that open access is able to address, and there aren't many other options, I think, in terms of that, and it's certainly part of the whole community and what libraries are about. So, humanities and social science, particularly humanities, there are a lot of subjects. Yes, there are more titles published than ever, but From a publisher's point of view, and I'm talking a lot of years on the clock, those titles do not cluster or aggregate very well. So if your research happens to be about part of the world that's not of huge concern to the North American library market, it's not so good. And it is in the nature of the research that not everybody is researching the same thing. So it does not add up to great numbers. A good example recently is that a researcher had to change the title of their book because it mentioned this sort of unknown city called London. This apparently just to actually name London is going to put off the North American library market, so it has to become a major world city. The book is entirely about London. It's quite insane, the distortions that can go on here. But it's certainly the case, for instance, if you're looking at some subject like literature, working for many years at the OUP, you knew you were onto a good thing. If you had a book on Shakespeare, yes, you'll get the numbers there. But if you were looking at more or less anything other than another 3 or 4 areas, it was going to be a hard sell. The Oxford University Press was keener on publishing in things like business and law where the numbers were higher, because that would give them a better return for the university, which is, my view, quite well funded anyway. But that is the thinking. So I won't get too much more into that, but just to say there are a series of interrelated problems here. And open access, I don't think is the total answer, but there are some interesting figures that have come through. We've been undertaking open access publishing for a while, and one of the longest standing publishers in the area, Open Book Publishers, which is sort of partly run by a guy called Rupert Gatty, has some very interesting figures. It shows that for monographs, the interest in reviews and downloads is something like 100 times more than compared to the conventional sales of a title in that format. And that's something he's observed over a long period of time. He's been doing this for a long time. More recently, UCL Press have published a book, which is, I think it's probably over 50,000 now. It's now probably has been published for a year or close to. That's 45,000 views. Now, this is not the kind of numbers you get in terms of sales of academic monographs, which are much more in the region of about 250, 300, and even then I can't help feeling I'm stretching it there. That's the top of their scale. At the bottom of their scale, they had a book which just amazed me on community planning and participation in the village in Mozambique. Now, at a rough guess, I would say this is something that A, wouldn't get published, and B, if it did, the numbers would be extremely low, perhaps under 30 worldwide. But they've had 2,000 downloads, and obviously a lot of that may be from Africa, from the people in development studies. But it's an interesting, there is a sort of real social benefit to open access. And our own title, we've done a book on, I would guess it's sort of, you would call it Marxist Theories of Communication, Frankfurt School. We've had something like 5 times, is it 5 times? In 4 months? Actually, no, I think it's probably now gone up to more like 6, 7, 8 times. Just trying to do the maths in my head. I think it's about 6 times now. The numbers that would have been the sales of a comparable title. I know the sales of the title, the author's told me another book he's published with another rival publisher. And Rupert Gatty's blog, I just mentioned it there, it's got some interesting things to say about what goes on and how open access publishing can be made to work, or if you like DIY academic publishing, does it always have to be in that through University Press. Right, now, so the wider environment, there's quite a lot of other things going on outside the university press sector, some of which you may or may not be aware of. The Royal Historical Society has now started on a programme of open access monographs. I think it's one of the least likely institutions in terms of the personnel to be enthusiasts for this. I think that in the ideal world they would want every book to be published by OUP and CUP, but it's not the ideal world. So particularly with early career researchers in mind in important areas that are not big sales, they've started to undertake a programme. The Modern Language Association have got this thing called Humanities Commons, which I think is definitely going to be worth keeping an eye on, which is also a scholarly community publishing open access. And self-publishing. Whenever I mention self-publishing, people immediately say, and they're probably right, that it's not got much of a future in terms of academic, because you've got to have peer review and so on. I think the peer review is something that could be organised if it was undertaken in a very concerted and organised way. And there is a company, spin-off of Lulu, called Glasstree, that likes to think so as too. So they're starting up. They've probably got a lot of money behind them, and they see that there's a future in self-publishing. I'm not sure. We'll have to see with that. Part of the publishing environment is also the social media networks, Academia Edu, ResearchGate, all sorts of small and large problems with those, but I'm guessing they haven't quite taken off as much as they might have been expected to do. But then again, people were saying Facebook, it's dead, it's had its day, and look where it is now. That was about 5 years ago. What also is happening, quite interestingly, is what I would call kind of transitioning presses. So existing print-based university presses that are now working with open access. Manchester, in fact, was one of the first to consider open access publishing. It has still has a finger in that pie. Liverpool have got quite an interesting thing called Modern Languages Open, which they've just started, particularly for the very difficult sort of sales-wise area of modern languages. And so I think what you're also seeing is that many of the existing publishers are beginning to look at open access for various reasons. One is to improve what they do in terms of scholarly communications. The other in terms of it might be commercial reason, it might be something else. But a push from the library, push from academics. It's probably worth also mentioning that some of the smaller university presses that are based in print are also thinking of doing this. One model of moving from what you might call kind of pejoratively a legacy sort of operation to open access is what I would call the kind of the open access digital channel. So California and Penn State are both going to be running. California is very well known, I think, called Luminos, running an open access program. It does cost $15,000. Now, it doesn't necessarily cost the author, but the whole $15,000. But I think it comes down to about half the money has to be found, which I think is still quite off-putting to a lot of people, and for quite obvious reasons. But I think what people are beginning to see are bigger presses having a sort of conventional arm, and then a much smaller but potentially growing open access department, venture channel. I use the word channel partly because the notion that you might have conventional publishing might be BBC One, but the open access might be sort of BBC Two, BBC Four. I think this is the sort of thing that we're going to see more of. And very recently, I think this report was undertaken before the new president. It was predicted that open access book revenues is going to increase 20% in the sort of commercial region. Now, I'd like to give you more idea of how that's going to happen, but I can't because the publication is not open access and I haven't got the money to spare. So, but there is quite likely that 20% that's growing is likely to be taken off print sales. So there's a movement going on there, there's a kind of trajectory. Now, university presses, they have different approaches, and so I think they tend to look a bit like dogs looking like their owners. I think that's a little bit how the university presses are beginning to look. So Goldsmiths is exciting and funky and innovative, and Westminster, I'll let you judge for that. Huddersfield is very musical and very sort of by the bootstraps, but they have a big music festival. It makes a lot of sense for them. So some of the strategies that go into informing what a university press does, so publishing local authors and trying to anticipate RAF is one of them. That's certainly been a big feature of UCL. It's certainly baked into the thinking about Westminster. Publishing a wide range of authors from outside the press, something that not many do, but I think it seems to work for Westminster in the sense that we begin to have distinctive subject clusters, and when let's say your numbers are quite tight, you don't want to be marketing titles in a huge range of subjects. And it also, I think, enforces the idea that a subject is an expert in an area, for instance, social media studies or other subjects. There are other motives and other parts of the strategy. So there's experimental, and there's also the possibility of even trade crossover. So I mentioned Goldsmiths, who've had a very successful book on life of academic and have done a NAP. UCL have this book, so it's open online content, and we've just published the first audio journal issue, relatively painlessly, on reframing media and cultural studies in the age of global crisis. And it was remarkably smooth to do. Publishing early career research is certainly one of the things that we've wanted to do in the university press sector, but it has proved a bit difficult because of concerns over RAF and the fear that it's too risky to go with a new press, an open access press or a new university press. This may be a mistake, but I think people have to make their own minds up, and I think the environment is going to get better in the future years. And certainly for scholars outside of the UK, we've had no problem with attracting early career researchers. Other aspects of the university press is obviously demonstrating the value of OA, advocacy and education around that. Public engagement, I think this one is understated. It's not even a trade non-fiction book these days can struggle to get print runs in excess of 1,000, 1,500, and I think there could be an opportunity for the publisher of the right books in the right area, and not doing everyone the same way, to achieve some sort of public interest and focus. And I think that's always been the case with print, but I think with open access it's even more so. And then textbooks is another area that open access and university presses are looking at. It's a bit patchy at the moment, and probably more taking place in the US, but Liverpool, Napier and a few other UCL have been engaged in that, and there is a rising concern about the cost of textbooks and what that's going to mean. So just check how many slides I've got back out. Okay, so just two more. So there are effects and dangers of what I've been talking about. I'll start with some of the dangers. Commercial publishing continues to shift towards science, technical, medical, particularly applied, and hard social science. It's still the case that an economics book is going to do better in terms of sales. And then there are the dangers that the open access could, or the existing scholarly environment could continue to sort of make access to publication very varied. So our library, for instance, is not able always to subscribe to journals for which the editor is even based at university. So it's sort of, it's going from students not being able to afford to libraries not being able to afford. It's a real crunch. Maybe it's unrealistic for everyone to have everything, but we are going down the opposite route. One of the dangers of open access, however, is we're just getting further metrification of the research environment, concentration of funds based on maybe dubious or not so dubious statistics, and that low impacts and citations could be problematic for humanities and social sciences. Patrick Dunleavy, I think, in an LSE impact blog, said that something along the lines of, well, there are an awful lot of publications that don't get any citations, therefore we shouldn't really do humanities. And there was that recent moment where the Japanese government apparently threatened to sort of focus all its attention on areas other than humanities because, well, they weren't paying the bills. So there are, I think, there are certain dangers definitely around that whole audit culture. Gold open access potentially, and that's been the model that's been pushed most directly. It does favour the universities with deep pockets or those who can support funds, and perhaps UCL could fall into that. I think green open access hasn't been fully explored, and that may be something Sarah would talk about. But at the moment, there is still quite a high cost attached to gold open access, although there are the range of costs for what a scholarly publication, book or journal article ranges hugely, and the fact is it's going down and should continue to go down. But you do charge quite a lot for prestige and for other surrounding elements. And if you continue on that basis, you'll have the double continuation of the double monopolies and controlling the channels to authorship. So you have to be a very special club to publish in our journal or with our book series. And then, it's restricted on the other side as well because the prices are very, very high. So I think the status quo, or what's been going on for the last 20 years, is really not great. And then, prestige, I think, is one very strong element of why prices remain high, and why I would argue places like Oxford University Press, less so the commercial publishers, who I think are much better on this, don't innovate so much. They will say, well, publish with Oxford, we are Oxford. It's not clear to me that they're always publishing better than the likes of Palgrave or other publishers like that. So anyway, to wrap up, there are some good effects to this sort of these developments. So one is under gold access, research-rich universities effectively donating their outputs or underwriting them, and certainly you get access to a much wider readership with open access. A lot more countries, a lot more places can read the books, and I think the Mozambique example is quite a good one. I think we're in an environment where there is an advantage to publishing in open access. I think authors, writers, institutions will have a benefit, short-term advantage over their sort of compatriots. I was recently at a meeting in Manchester where the research director of a social science department was saying, well, you have to publish with the top journals. There's nothing else possible. I checked the number of downloads and citations she'd had in 6 years on, which looked like a very, very good article actually, to be fair, was less than I had with something which was published open access on this sort of topic in 10 days. So yes, in terms of kind of career, that may have been a sensible thing to do, but if there is no interest in readership, I think something's gone very wrong. What can the future be? I've not talked a great deal about the finances of this, and I will come back on that. But there are three revenue streams. There are grants, there are collaborative funding schemes, and there are sales in terms of the new university presses and open access publishers. I think in whatever form that we emerge, the future needs to be collaborative. It needs to be libraries, authors, students, readers getting together to something towards a more sustainable open access. Now, I recently read on the train, I read an article which is saying that there's a thing in economics called club theory. So it's suggesting that club theory might be the answer to ways of developing schemes, collaborative funding schemes that will help open access emerge. We'll see on that, but there's a lot of experiments out there at the moment which are testing the viability of libraries being involved in schemes that will fund this sort of publishing, including things like Knowledge Unlatched and many others sponsored by Andrew Mellon. In the future, obviously I think established publishers will still have the prestige offering and will be able to do things better than these tiny presses, the micro presses like the University of Westminster, things such as textbooks, databases, reference materials, all sorts of things. Things at scales that small publishers can't do. And potentially also sort of programs of subscription programs that kind of scale up very well. I think the singular business model, which is often you hear a lot about, what is your business model, blah, blah, blah. I think I'm not even really happy with that in wider media terms. I think the singular business model is a very good marketing tool for people involved, pitching to venture capitalists and so on. In practice, I think a lot of people just have to look at kind of costs and revenues, and the idea that there's going to be one singular business model that's going to fit everything for all in all subjects, I don't think that's going to happen. It seems to me the wrong terminology. And to conclude, what I hope obviously this new sector, these new developments are going to lead is to lower cost, maybe not totally low cost, high impact in terms of what can be achieved in terms of readership compared to what we have now. And it's a relatively modest mission, because I think a lot of the more the top-selling things will probably still continue to be published in their existing homes. However, there is a vast and very extensive need for diversity, for other channels, and pressure to bring innovation and lower pricing into the equation. And it's a collective endeavour. So I'm going to end there. I can sense I'm overrunning, and hand you over.
Thank you very much. think we have time for one or two brief questions before Sarah takes over. If anybody wants to start us off, or I wonder if you could say a little bit. I mean, one of the things that seemed that you didn't discuss was actually innovation in relation to the form of the book and the article itself. That we're still publishing things that look like.
Yeah. A few things on that. Recently, in March last year, there was a conference on university presses, and one thing that came up when this issue was raised was that a lot of publishers are not seeing the demand for it.
Yeah.
I mean, demand is maybe not the right word, but people are not coming forward together with the projects that need that innovation. And I think the reason is simply, a lot to do with work pressures and the forms in which academic labour is recognised. I would say, though, that we work with Ubiquity Press, and we've just done this audio issue, and it remains to be seen how successful it will be, but it was infinitely easier working with them as a digital-first company than it has been, let's say, working with OUP or Outreach, where their systems have been geared over decades to produce the 8,000 word research article, the 80,000 word book. There's some very interesting research, I think again connected to Mellon funding, which is looking at how scholars use research, and I think that could be quite interesting in terms of seeing what people really want. I think we all have our own ideas, but to actually, it's like an anthropology mapping of how people make notes, etc., etc. So I think in a sense, yes, you're right, but there's a lot of other things going on as well.
I'm almost sorry to ask, but where does your funding come from?
It comes from our library.
And you don't have really revenue.
We have, the idea is to build up revenue from sales. So typically speaking, an open access book will sell roughly the same number of copies as a conventional format. The difference is the conventional format will sell at a very high price, so £80, and the open access one tend to come in might publish at £25, something like that. So we do get revenue from that, and there's increasing evidence that people who are keenest on the work will buy print as well. I mean, in the ideal world, we'd all want print, but it is interesting to see the extent which print sales are still going. And the third stream I think I mentioned was the notion of these collaborative funding schemes, knowledge and match and so on. I think those potentially are the future, but it's a long way to see before we can actually have something which works for everybody, works for the circumstances. But what I'd say about 7 or 8 experiments of this going to go on at the moment, and we'll see if they pan out. So the notion is based on open book publishers to look at these 2 streams of funding, and they're apparently very clean. I think you can query that, but it seems to be the best option to really looking at in terms of getting to the best balance of cost.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. That just leads me to introduce our next speaker, who's Sarah Kember, Professor Sarah Kember, who's the founding director of Goldsmiths Press. Her research focuses on the future of publishing, digital media, smart media, and questions of mediation and feminist science and technology studies. And most recently, she's published iMedia, the Gendering of Objects, Environments, and Smart Materials in 2016, as well as works on optics, cyberfeminism, photography, and subjectivity.
I think one of the differences is that I'm going to talk more from the perspective of an academic than a publisher. I'm not going to say too much about Goldsmiths Press publishing model, although I can do later on if you want me to. This is actually a talk I should have given at MEXA, but there were train issues and snow, so I didn't. It was Andrew's panel, and these were his questions. I think they're pretty good questions, so I'm going to run through them quite quickly with you. The what's happening, why question, I don't know how much you guys know. So basically, a lot of universities, I don't know if it's going to be 12, I think it wouldn't surprise me if it was, as well as independents, are sort of taking up the opportunities afforded by digital technology to experiment with publishing. DIY scholarly publishing. Most of them, all of us, are online and open access to an extent, to differing extents, I think. But my point really has always been that being online and open access is nowhere near enough. And it actually can be a problem. I think it certainly isn't a destination for publishing. There is no final ground for publishing. There is no solution to the problem of publishing. This isn't it. The danger of being open access, I think, is it tends to preclude an engagement with a wider politics of communication. I think it steers our attention rightly to copyright and paywalls. It should do that, but that becomes too narrow a focus for me. And I think what we're failing to do through open access is do anything other than comply, to be perfectly honest with you, with how I see the sort of current terms and conditions of a neoliberal academy. And that's a lot to ask a publisher to do. But I think we can use publishing to address those sort of wider political issues in academia. So obviously, you know, we're getting innovation so that publishers, for obvious reasons, can not charge readers for a version, a digital version of their book. It's usually a PDF. It is a PDF. It may come in the gold version, the sort of final edited, typeset, proofread, perfect, or the green version, which is an earlier version than that, obviously. But then again, I tend to see all of these publishers as hybrid, in as far as everybody is still producing and charging for print books, right? Including POD, including print on demand. And Goldsmiths, I mean, I'll flash up the logo and stuff at the MAB. I think, we're probably one of the first, because we really do see ourselves as hybrid, right? We're print and digital. We do print books and apps. We're sort of conventional and green OA. But because we knew we were going to go that way, we looked at issues of marketing, sales, and distribution very, very early on. That was a big issue for us. We addressed it head on. We partner with MIT Press, who do all of that for us, not free, I might add. And I think other publishers are coming to that a little bit later, but they are coming to it. And I think one of the reasons they're coming to it later than we did is because I think there's a de facto assumption that being online and OA is the solution to the problem of publishing at the moment, and I don't think it is. So we've had this change to wanting to sort of make digital versions available free to use and reuse. There is also the tendency to want to look at making charges to authors, as Andrew said. And well, UCL do, Open Book do, Luminos do, and they're tending to charge authors when they are not based at the home institution quite a lot of money, as Andrew was saying. And the risk there is that you don't get the submissions in those areas. And you also can, I mean, I signal it as a risk rather than as necessarily what's happening in each and every case, but you can end up looking like a vanity press if you're not careful. So Goldsmiths would not have been a conventional UP. We're too small, we don't have the scale, we don't have the infrastructure. But really, the digital opportunity for us is about being digitally led rather than digital only. The digital is the context for publishing. But it's not about transitions from print to digital. It's not about transitions, for me, from sort of proprietary objects to OA. The opportunity is there to intervene, I think, in this wider politics of communication. And precisely this is really what motivated me, was, you know, the wider environment of the audit, of commercialization and privatization, being a climate in which we really needed to reevaluate scholarship in terms of, you know, what counts as scholarship and who is counting, so issues of difference and diversity being really right up front for us, rather than the kind of more of an afterthought, which I think it can be in terms of policy at least. So this was Andrew's second question, which causes me to be a bit flip, actually, because my answer to that question is if only they knew, right? RCUK, HEFKI, I don't think they do. I think the push to OA is primarily ideological and not practical. I think the edict comes. I think the consultation periods come and go very, very quickly. They're a little bit closed, I think, as well at the moment, and I can feel a bit bitter about that. You know, and the actual sort of practicalities, I think, are a bit of an afterthought. I mean, there is this consultation now, hefty consultation on the second ref, which is looking at mandating open access monograph publishing for the third ref. Yeah. This would be the gold preferred version, and it's notwithstanding the kinds of concerns that Jeff Crossick raised in this GIST guide to open access monograph publishing, which include things like, you know, what are we going to do about third-party rights? What about quality assurance? And the fact, and it is quite a big one to sit in the room with you, there is no sustainable business model for open access publishing. Plough on, you know, never mind. Let's kind of crack on with it. My concerns are bigger than his. You know, I agree with him. Those are real issues. But we're talking about mandating, you know, for the next ref, monograph publishing. Nobody's talking about what the monograph is or could be. It is an inherently standardised model that we're still working with. Questions about values in relationship to value are not coming up. They're not being foregrounded. You know, that's a problem for me, that diversity of the book and diversity of the scholar and scholarship is an afterthought in this kind of policy edict. For me, the dominant agenda is top-down for OA. I know there's a grassroots. I'm part of it. I'm associated with it. You know, uncomfortably for I think all concerned sometimes is scholar-led radical OA movement. I understand completely why it's there, and you know, kind of sign up to it to a certain extent. But the dominant agenda is undoubtedly top-down. It's government-led. It's governmental in a regulatory sense. It's oriented towards a commercial Creative Commons license, CC BY license. As you will know, we have to have that for articles for the next ref. And, you know, that's clearly an agenda oriented to commercial research and potentially commercialised research and to a limited reading of impact, notwithstanding the Stern Review that just came through. We are pushing the gold model. There are huge questions about how deep an institution's pockets are going to be in order to fund that model. Processing charges inevitably become part of it, and for me that's where the real danger lies. And I know I'm not the only one who is concerned about this, but you know what I think that means as a sort of a policy drive is potentially not just the control but the reduction, massive reduction of output across the arts, humanities and social sciences, for the simple reason that it's not cheap still to publish books. It is not cheap to publish books. Most of us are hybrid publishers. Yeah. Polgrave, if you want to publish OA with them, I think it's between 7,000 and 11,000. As Andrew was saying, Luminos is going to be about $7,000, $7,000.
It's 15,000, of which they
they chip in. You know, it's costing. Although we're not charging processing charges, we don't want to do it. It costs us around about 5,000 to publish a book, I guess. You know, the OA version's the cheapest I've seen, about 3.5. So there is no money available. There's no extra money, funding, going to be made available to support these forms of expenditure and devolution of research and research output to institutions. We can see what's happening with the block grants for articles, for journals, right? You know, it doesn't surprise me terribly that their distribution is becoming increasingly polarised. Goldsmiths got a very small block grant for journal publishing first time round. This time round, nothing. Okay? So the responsibility, I think, is being pushed onto institutions. I think they face an inevitably unethical task of distributing, you know, whatever size pot of money. It might be a lot if you're a Russell Group, you know, and in Goldsmiths' case, nothing, among a wide and diverse group of researchers. What's going to give? It's not difficult. Width, diversity, equality are all, I think, questioned in this model. Who benefits? You know, I'm just going to go with the cynical. I may not come back from that particular edge. It's a cost-cutting exercise on some level, isn't it? It's yet another mechanism of control, regulation, and privatisation. And the obligation to be open, as John Holmwood, a sociologist, has been arguing, is extremely uneven. As in, the obligation falls on the public sector, not on the private sector. Goldsmiths is obliged to be open, Google is not obliged to be open. You know, that's a stark picture, but it happens to be the case. So yes, there are opportunities, and I'm not contradicting those. I think the obligation exceeds them. The opportunities are there. It was absolutely necessary to do something to challenge the ridiculously high price walls put up by commercial journal publishers. The Elsevier deal, is very damaging to institutions. I'm not sure, to be perfectly honest with you, that the grassroots OA is actually effectively challenging those situations at the moment. Yes, wider readership, and certainly more countries. I think the more countries is really, really key. Wider readership. So how do you compare? Well, let's take the optimistic. We did quite well with Academic Diary. That's about 2,500 at the moment, book sales. Okay, I do not know how to compare that to 20,000 book views. I don't. I think it's interesting, right? I think it's a space of contestation, and that's interesting, to compare book views or page views with sales, but they're not like for like. So I leave that there, as an interesting problem. Yes, OA material is easier to use in teaching, easier to use in research, much easier to use for an industry, and I think that's probably more the point of it. There is, for me, a very dangerous ideological adherence to the notion of openness as a necessary good. Open is a nice word, we like it. I think you can really only subscribe to a notion of openness as a necessary good if you sign up to neoliberal public policy. That is removing restrictions to the knowledge economy to free up global competitiveness. That's what it was for. I read the Finch report, I read the Hargreaves review. The language is clear. The purpose is very, very clear. I think higher education is perhaps an unfortunate casualty necessary in the view of policy, and I don't think publishers were what they had in mind either. I think tech industry and the growth of the tech industries were, but not publishing and not publishers. I mean, we are rightly trying to do something in the face of the current state of commercial publishing, but as Andrew says, those publishers are kind of more or less holding their crown quite effectively, being able to experiment on the edges with what is effectively flipping a business model from charging readers to charging authors at great cost, I think, to our institutions. So I think if we, as academics, I'm speaking as an academic mostly here, want our work to be more accessible, and I think the terms of the debate about public engagement and accessibility are problematic at the moment, but it would be a very good idea if we owned them. But if we want our work to be more accessible, I don't think we can see that as the same thing as access. I think just because work is there and it's available doesn't necessarily make it readable or accessible in a broader sense. I think if we want to challenge the constraints of commercial publishing, of the ref, of these ridiculously standardised modes of communication that are available to us at the moment, the two modes, the journal, the textbook, we need to, as I've been arguing over the last few years, open out from open access, basically. Which is not to say get rid of it or dismiss it out of hand, but certainly take a position within it that is more questioning and less compliant. So I really ought to get to this issue now. That's what it boils down to for me. That's the kind of end game scenario for me. Yeah, the reduction and control of research right across the arts, humanities and social sciences. John Holmwood again, is arguing that the language of openness is powerful, it is persuasive. We really ought to be able to deal with that academically. For him, open means closed is kind of double speak. It means something more like privatisation, commercial enclosure. I think we need to do that work. I think we need to lobby more, as I do believe someone from this institution, Paul Kirby from International Relations, has been arguing. Lobby hard, in as far as we've still got a space to do that, for green open access, which is, I think, the only model that's potentially sustainable. But I think we need to do a lot more at the policy level, as I kind of tend to refer to it, below the line of publishing, which is scholarly practice, which is the stuff like citation, peer review, free labour, the metrics issue. All of those are regulating academic work, academic life, academic output in highly structured and differentiated ways: gender, race, class, career stage, Open access as a model is not going to fix those things. We need to be addressing them. For me, necessarily outside of what is effectively a bit of a smokescreen of OA to a certain extent. Even the ground-up version, I think, is distracting from those kind of wider issues. I want to be a little bit kind of more upbeat, so I like this question a lot. And yes, experimentation through hybrid publishing, through digital publishing, is definitely on the cards. It's not necessarily happening for all sorts of reasons. It would be a reworking of earlier forms of publishing intervention, publishing experimentation, the artist book, feminist publishing. It's distinctly a possibility. It's not happening that much. Why isn't it happening? Well, we do have the slight problem that we don't have a sustainable business model for access publishing. Audiovisual publishing, which is what obviously Goldsmiths really wants to do a lot of, is incredibly expensive. I have spent a fortune on an app, and I have to give it away, yeah? And it will take me a long time to figure out how to make that work financially for us. And we have, as Andrew was indicating, an extremely conservative academy in the sense of promotions and tenure and ref submissions. We're not allowed to put the Book of Nails into the media panel as yet. So for me, I know it sounds dismissive. I'm not actually dismissing open access as a model. Neither am I interested in reforming open access, as Martin Ebers, pulling it back from the grip of neoliberalism. That's not my task. I don't really want to contest it that hard. I do think we should lobby for green, but this is not about colours. It's not, green is the answer or platinum is the answer. It isn't that simple. I agree with Anthony Collins at Liverpool, who's been arguing for a while that, you shouldn't be switching publishing models here. We all did this and now we all do that. This is all part of a picture that is much more kind of open and up for grabs. The real issues for me have to do with not copyright or even paywalls per se, but we do have to recognise how publishing relates to these wider policy issues around privatisation and the incursion of venture capital into HE. I think academia.edu, etc. This is a real issue, and I think when we're talking about green and repository-based open access, yes, we can all do that. I think Goldsmiths is one of the few that's doing that for books at the moment. But even that, I don't think it's enough to be doing it on our own. I think we need to look seriously at collaborations, consortia, publishing networks, joining potentially those repositories together in order to scale up to meet anything like the volume and the investment in things like academia, which is basically taking our stuff and making a lot of money out of it. So, yes, DIY scholarly publishing, good. We're going to have to evolve our own infrastructure to make that work, I think. I think OA per se is too simplistic as a publishing model. It is too problematic as a business model, and it's a false claim. Open is closed. But there is something in between this kind of, for me, fantasy of free knowledge and free culture and the reality of something increasingly monopolistic and proprietorial, and that has to do with these networks. It has to do with collaboration. We partner formally with MIT because they're very good at marketing, sales and distribution, and they're doing that for us, and they're doing a good job for us. The more exciting collaboration potentially is the one that we have with other new UPs and independent scholars, and we're bringing in libraries, museums, archives, galleries. That's exciting. Potentially, there could be something in those collaborations that together, because I don't think we are going to do it on our own, and I don't think, at the moment, I fear the landscape is it's going to get crowded, it's going to get more competitive, it's going to get more Darwinian, it's certainly entrepreneurial out there with Open Library of Humanities and Knowledge Unlatched and all of that. I think there is a possibility to do something different to that is more strategic and more collaboratively interventional. And I'm excited about. For me, it is really about the wider politics and the attempt to to think beyond the compliance issues with Hive. So just to finish, why publish is the key question for me. The second bit of that question I'm not so keen on, because I do think there's a bit of a technocratic consensus. I think that there is a sense that publishing, humanities, the academy, Copyright Act is all broken in the age of digital technology, and we have to therefore fix it. And we kind of meet in the middle there, the top down and the bottom up, and it kind of negates, I think, too much debate and intervention. We need to get rid of that, open out from open access, really engage this wider politics, definitely separate access from accessibility. It's not the same thing. Key issue for me is to focus in on diversity. We know that publishing utterly lacks diversity and is going to get worse if we don't intervene. And ultimately, you know, it comes down to reevaluating scholarly practice, which, you know, OA again could do, isn't. That's me.
Thank you very much. We just have time for some direct questions for Sarah, and then maybe we'll open it up to a broader discussion. I wonder if I can start really where you ended, which is, you know, if one of the opportunities is to interrogate and change citation, peer review, and scholarly practice, you know, what small things can a press? I mean, you run a press. You both run presses. You know, what can we actually build in that is a step in the right direction?
Well, one of the things that I've been sort of familiar with is what some of the OA journals do. Mm-hmm. So Ada, for example, on their advisory board, and they've kind of switched from, you know, the idea that, I mean, and I agree that peer review is broken in some things that, you know, it's extremely problematic. Okay, let's avoid the kind of crisis reform kind of narrative. It's extremely problematic. But is the answer to, you know, a double-blind peer review open peer-to-peer review? No, I don't think so. I think it's too technological a solution. So you need the infrastructure for it. It's incredibly labour-intensive, and when free labour is part of your problem, it is, and it falls unevenly on the early career researchers, etc. And gender is a big issue in all of this. Then, you know, that isn't the solution. I don't think they're claiming that it is. For me, you know, I don't have an answer to the problem of peer review, but small things that we've been doing, and pragmatics, to be perfectly honest, is part of that. It's increasingly difficult to get anybody to review anything, and you have to sit with that. You have to acknowledge that. You know, everyone's workloads on crazy. You know, I don't want to spend all of our time on the press and chasing the reviewers down. So you need to streamline it a little bit. But in terms of making an intervention, one of the things that we've done is to ask reviewers to comment on citation practices, where these may have become a little bunched. So we actually explicitly asked them to talk about that, so that we avoid this kind of narrowing and conservative self-reproduction of a scholarly system. So little things, actually. But I don't want to claim that Goldsmiths Press is going to fix those issues in scholarly practice. I just think what's important is we address them. And I think I have to be a little bit outside of my way to do that.
Thank you both for the presentation. I work as a lecturer in the School of Education, Social Work, and I have this consistent dilemma that I thought maybe you could advise upon. Our research goes out to exposing to the public, but the problem is that members of the public don't have access to it because of the paywall. And that includes charities, artists, and so on. But also, we do research in countries like Ghana, Egypt, Palestine, Kazakhstan, and I'm starting to sense a neo-colonial approach to our publishing, where we go, we mine the data, we bring it back, we manufacture it, we publish it, and they don't have access to it, though, and often they are co-authors on those papers, which creates ethical issues because they cannot use those publications in their classes. They don't have subscriptions. It's absolutely expensive. So I have started considering open access because of that. Particularly the modules that Routledge now has and Sage, they have beta journals where the publisher where the author pays. But the problem is, where do you get the funding for that? The fees are not that high, but they're less than the normal charge, but it's still an amount to be paid. And of course, the argument that you mentioned about does everybody have access to it, is it fair, and so on. If we go for I also consider the totally open access journals, but there has been resistance within the academic circles and colleagues towards that because of the rough submissions, rigor, you're not always sure about rigor, and of course promotions and things like that, particularly if you're writing as a team. So and I think this is a question for both of you, what is the solution to practically speaking, in light, I'm not thinking what the ideal situation is, but in light of what we have now at the situation, particularly concerning international research, because we work a lot with international researchers, it's becoming increasingly ethically problematic to go there and for them not to have access.
For me, OA would be part of that strategy. I just don't think it's for me, the way that OA fits in is only through at the moment, through the green route, which means, we do a lot of quality checks at Goldsmiths Press. We're proofreading, we're doing a lot of things that other, when you're trying to cut costs, other publishers are not doing at the moment to ensure quality, but it means it's expensive. We have to get some kind of return on the books that we publish, but we can put a version of that book in an archive, in an institution archive, perhaps under the standard embargo period. I think is average is now 18 months.
This is talking books?
Yeah, the books.
I think it varies on subjects between 6 and 18.
It can be 6 months. It can be, I think the average is probably about 12 months. So we're putting, because we're only publishing books, we're not doing journals. But I can talk a bit about why we're not. But that's a solution. Okay, so that is
but even that has been criticised by our colleagues because they cannot, for example, the page numbers are different from we're talking about really high level scholars in these countries.
Yeah.
It also gives signals, gives a message that you're not good enough or something like that. That you need to wait. We don't, but you need to wait. They don't. They can't use. They can't cite exact because we've had discussions about them. They can't have exact quotations because the page numbers will be different often from the actual final print. The whole idea about the embargo itself signals gives a psychological message that you need to wait while we just make use of it. And then we open the door.
Yeah, I agree. It is imperfect, and I think that there's a lot of kind of grey area between the versions. I think there's a lot to say about the versioning, and I'm not sure about where I'm going to take Goldsmiths Press with it at the moment because I think I don't know if it's these are not actual clear colours really. I think there is something in between the kind of this kind of slightly seem to be inferior versioning of the green OA model and the seemingly superior gold model. And there are other ways of creating something sustainable around a gold model. It's just not obvious what that is. And I think for me, quite often it's a case-by-case thing. I mean, I can publish gold OA if there is a kind of business model that fits that particular project. I've got to keep the presses head above water. But say a project comes in and it's it's got a grant attached to it, for example, and we can facilitate those grant applications by writing into them. Yeah, that's one other route. But I'm sure, I think there are others. I think these other sort of mechanisms or networks that we're talking about could get us to a place where we can do a kind of, if you like, never mind the actual official kind of gold standard OA, that in a way that we can sustain. But right now, I don't think there's a clear-cut answer to
I think in the specific instance, there are a few things that one can just sort of say. Well, I guess one is, I don't know if Sussex, it's the case of Sussex, but many universities have an access fund, which enables people to make articles they publish conventionally open access. And from what I've heard, and I think this will change the nearer you get to that, most of those funds are undersubscribed because people don't like filling in the forms, they don't like applying to jump through a whole other set of hurdles for an answer that may not be yes. But it's certainly the case at Westminster is that the fund exists and people are not using it. So there's a possibility you could solve the problem quite easily if there is a fund at Sussex and it works for you. I don't know if there is.
I mean, it just strikes me that, I mean, in a sense, there isn't a solution, and there's clearly not going to be a solution. But there are a series of strategies. And I mean, one of the things that really strikes me about the question is that, what Sarah was talking about was, in a sense, OA being a product of the neoliberal university and top-down strategy and the imposition. And the question becomes, well, how do you actually use those strategies and impositions in a way to achieve anything that's useful and purposeful in relation to open access? And it just strikes me that each element of this is a tiny step in actually what is a much better direction than where we've been. I mean, I always go back to, I happened to lie to get into the round reading room at the British Library in the early 1980s. And the extent to which we were in an absolutely hierarchical, structured global economy of knowledge that excluded 90% of the world. And now we're in one that excludes 85% of the world. And it's a question of finding those strategies. And I think lying and cheating is my solution in most cases.
Compromise, the risk I see related with this rejoicing diversity of micro-presses or publishing initiative is the question of findability. You mentioned that you cannot rely just on your website to spread your work. So what are the strategies out there, and which one you see the more promising?
Well, at the moment we're quite conventional in that sense because we have a North American massive marketing, sales and distribution arm called MIT Press. And they're doing all of that for us. Yes, we have a website. Do we get a lot of traffic from the website? No, we don't. And we pay for that.
Yeah. On books, I'd say, there is a conventional sort of channel, which is kind of, bibliographical data, that's what it is. And it works surprisingly well. So one of the things, although we have our publications that are labelled free, we do get quite a lot of downloads from certainly from the journals, and numbers are really quite high. I'm certainly aware if you were able to select more conventional channels, the kind that MIT are really good at, so that you would put in the search terms, and near the top should come up on Amazon or something like that. And we won't get into problems with Amazon, but that should show.
But when we're talking about open access, do you manage, for example, to have your publication in library catalogs, so that from the library catalog you can click and learn on the
There's a lot of work being done on that side of things. I would say for me there are two parallel channels. There's a kind of conventional channel, and that works its own way, but we always often come against kind of very wall or whatever. And then there's the open access channel, and those two don't overlap very well. I think those people who can manage to bring those two together are cracked it. And not everyone has. I don't think anyone has, but I know a lot of people working on this, and there is a type of person who exists out in the world. There's not many of them. They're the metadata nerds, and some of them work. They are very busy and very active.
Can I just say, yes, from a library perspective, there's something called the Directory of Open Access Books, and if there's publishing the details of your metadata for your book in there, then our discovery systems will pick up that metadata. So our users will find that.
So can the user then download the text directly from the inside the library catalog?
Yeah. I mean, those channels, I think, there are kind of quite tried and tested routes, although you know more about this than me, for both print books and EPUB versions. But they're not this, they kind of operate differently from, for example, what we're paid for, which is catalog, kind of a particular publisher's catalogue, presence at all of the book fairs, and there is, in getting a physical copy of a book into a bookshop still has, surprisingly actually, worked for us for the first time in a kind of a serendipity sense. I mean, we didn't really see any of this coming, to be perfectly honest with you. We were working with Les Back on Academic Diary, and he's saying, I really, really want this to be a very cute little penguin-y print book. And can it please be £6? And we were going, I don't think we can do that. But how about £9.95? Which, of course, MIT were really unhappy about, because that's not their pricing scheme. And yes, it's risky coming out of that sort of price. It's very risky coming straight out of paper. I understand this now. But there it was, sitting in foils, so that people kind of wandered in. And one of those people was the editor at The Lancet, who happened to love it. So those sort of old roots to publishing shouldn't be underestimated. But none of these things are exclusive. They're mutually exclusive.
I think it's probably one of my number one issues at the moment. Is looking at asking questions of all different sort of sectors or routes. And the thing is, I don't think anyone understands all three of them at the same time. and so there's work to be done there.
It's something we can pool knowledge on.
Yeah.
We've been very good at open sourcing, haven't we? We, the kind of the newbies, have been kind of caring and sharing quite a lot in terms of the information and the comparing notes.
There is also the murky world of indexes. And they're like sort of private clubs. You have to petition to be like you do to publish in a journal. So you have to beg and plead and so on. And then sometimes you also have to pay as well. And I just don't understand. It's a very strange world, but they are quite important in some subject areas.
I've got a question about the question you didn't want to answer, Sarah, both of you, which is where technology might lead you next, or at least what I'm interested in is that discrepancy between book views, page views, and sales, which says something about reading and radically different methods of dealing with, as an academic, what you do with the stuff people have written, actually. Assuming you accept all three as somehow valid ways to interact with what someone wrote. So I'm interested in, what you think the difference really means.
Well, I think
a massive discrepancy.
I feel a massive discrepancy.
Yeah, that massive discrepancy. What that, what you think that means, or how you understand that in terms of reading practices like academics. And I guess the second thing is just about, somehow what you think publishers might increasingly do with data. What might be tracked further, and how far I'm really asking about the change in the status of what constitutes a book or a piece of, what you can do with the data, and who is data tracking? Both of you.
So I'll start with the first one. I do have I have come across, just released in January, really rather interesting thing about academic reading practices. So if I could sort of read the kind of content, I could send you the reference to that. I haven't read it in full, but I just thought it was really addressing what you were looking at, and I thought it was very interesting. The extent to which people sort of search through things, scan them.
Well, we talked too much, I think, about speed. Quick what? Speed. Quick and slow. The kind of quick publishing, quick academia, slow academia. Should we be slowing down? Are we going too fast and we're not paying attention? For me, it really doesn't come down to speed. I think what's useful about having things, on open access and online, is you can do your research in phases. You can quickly survey what's out there, what's going on. It doesn't preclude a longer read. And I think when you come to longer reads, it can be online, but when you start getting to book length material, that gets more tricky. It gets much less desirable still. Maybe that will change as the presentation of a book in a Gold OA online model. I mean, I'm not convinced by the stuff I'm seeing that much. We know that print books still sell, and that they still have their appeal, and there's all that stuff about materiality. I think there's different paces of reading, rather than kind of going for the hysterical, no one's reading anymore, or we're not paying attention, or attention spans are of gnats. I don't think it's as simple as that. Yes, we're having to, we're all incredibly overloaded, and that's a factor. And I don't think you can separate any of these things out meaningfully. But I see a quick and a slow potential with that. I cannot equate page views with book sales. I think it's such a different thing that you cannot compare them. But I like it. I like that Rupert Gatti at Open Book is producing a lot of data. This is coming to your question. In collaboration with other publishers. I
think it's part of a wider project as well.
But that data at the moment is being used as a form of ideological advocacy for open access publishing.
That would be my
yeah. That's how it's been used right now. So look, we can get 60 million page views. Fine, but that's not an answer. That's a space for contesting what publishing and reading is. But let's look at it on that basis rather than saying this is the rationale. I mean, institutionally you kind of have to do it. If you put your thing into open access, you've got to do that. You've got to justify it. But I don't find that helpful. Actually, I think these other questions are more interesting, and we should be drilling straight into them. And I'm worried that OA gets in the way of that.
I think data can really get in the way. I mean, I'm looking at the Google Analytics and our journal articles, and after about an hour or so, my head was completely spinning. I didn't feel I'd learned anything that was really useful or indicative, and it was distracting me from more important tasks. Which is not to say, I just think we have to kind of, at some point we have to say, okay, so data isn't the only thing that is allowed to count. We've got to talk about other things in data.
Yeah, there's counting beyond data, but there's data being, again, Ada, they're kind of trying to generate data so that, for example, when they have people working, publishing with them who are early career scholars, or working on the press that are early career scholars, they've got some data they can use, to empower them. There is something in that contestation of data, but it's not about.
It strikes me that there are a whole series of technologically enabled ways of addressing precisely some of the things that have come up here. And it's not about Google Analytics and downloads. It's really about the way in which you trace information into and out of that thing that we decided to pour into a single jar and call a book or an article. And that if we could actually have a model that says citation is not simply what you put in a footnote. Citation is a line of use and reuse across communities and readership groups. You would end up with something much more useful that actually does kind of address what, and actually open access publishing allows for that. It facilitates it.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with that, and I just think the Goldsmiths, and there is this kind of dog owner thing going on, which is this is what Goldsmiths Press looks like. Let's not settle for the forms that are, they've narrowed so dramatically. We can't write essays anymore because they're not referable. Essays are lovely, discursive, angry, polemical things. We can't do them because they're not. But that's
they're called blogs.
Well, no, they're really not. We've got to, this is the opportunity. That's one of the, I kind of walked in with my eyes shut, kind of knowingly, because this was a space in which those questions could come up again. What is scholarship? What does it look like? What kind of forms does it? That doesn't mean to say, we should all kind of glorify the experimental. That's again far too simplistic. But these are spaces in which we finally, potentially, can contest what on earth has been going on. But I actually think OA is taking us the wrong way.
On the technology thing, I think in the long run there may be more potential for authors to get over this sort of typesetting hurdle. I think if it doesn't seem to be very far away from the point where you'll be able to write into a template which will automatically typeset it. I mean, actually Word is a typesetting program, it's just a really, really lousy one. I think Martin Eve is working on, the Young Library of Humanities is working on technological tools I think the language translation program and typesetting module, which I think could help at least with the DIY thing, work really well.
Although DIY or more academic labour is an interesting question.
I think some of the labour has been doubling up though. I mean, at the end of the day, someone has to check, has to check that things are consistent and so on. It's either the academic or the publisher. In the top journals, it's still the academic. And in other journals where there's a bit more slack in that, it ends up being the publisher. Yeah. These are the things that are going to get more automated, and I'm amazed that they are now. So I think there is some sort of hope that there will be technological tools, but I think they have to be really focused not on making money, not necessarily on supporting big publishers, but on actually really helping the academics clear out all the difficulty that stops them from writing and presenting them to them in the best possible way. And there are plenty of those.
At its origins, open access was mainly about reducing the cost of academic publication. My understanding is that now nobody believes really anymore that open access publishing will cost less than traditional publishing. Even in the governmental circle, I mean, UK. Do you share this understanding?
Well, I think just in terms of the book, something like anywhere between 30 and 50% of the book doesn't go to the publisher, doesn't go to the author, it goes to the intermediaries, wholesalers, aggregators, all sorts of folk who are literally occupying the space between the two. So I think there's a bit of money to be saved there via open access. And publishers, for a long time, would love, certainly in the sort of trade, and I think also to a certain extent in academic, they would love to go direct to consumer. But the infrastructure ensures that a whole bunch of money is taken away because it's not possible in terms of industry structures. So it is cheaper, I think, and not to pretend so is wrong. However, if the model is still based on the prestige and restriction, well, also they can still charge whatever they want for it, and there's been less money spent on it via the aggregators and via other sorts of means. So I think the savings is still there.
Could I actually comment on something that seemed to me to sit under the surface in both your talks, which is that for most of these books, the main consumer is actually university libraries. That for a traditional monograph at 150 to 200 copies, 250 copies, it is absolutely university libraries. And the notion of consortia implies that actually what these new presses should be doing is essentially creating a consortia of the consumers who then also become the producers through the university presses. But kept coming back to my mind is just what kind of scale that would need to be at in order to work effectively with either open access or other forms of self-publication.
I mean, some of these schemes, I think the Open Library of Humanities has got up to something like 300-400 subscribing libraries, but it does seem to hit, there does seem to be a sort of slight ceiling there. So I think once you get to that number, I think the danger is other libraries may think, well, they're doing very well, we'll keep our hands in our pockets. But those sorts of numbers are, they're workable. Well, what is not so clear is the kind of structure that enables them to perpetuate year after year in area after area. And we talk a lot about consortia.
Yeah. I think the problem that I have with that one, apart from its entrepreneurial, is that it tends to reproduce the old model as a standard, and I'd be asking a different thing, I think, slightly from a network, not necessarily exactly that kind of financial balancing act. I think that could be part of it. I think it's, in a sense, it's a different lobbying group for me, and I think, again, I would want it to think about what it was doing and why, and how to bring in, other public bodies, some big friends out there we have, that might help us, rather than all of us individually or setting up as Open Book or setting up as Open Library of Humanities and trying to flog subscriptions to each other's libraries, which seems to me just bizarre, frankly. We agree that actually there's a neutral body like the BL, for example. That is an absolutely clear opportunity for me at the moment, beyond anything Goldsmiths would do on its own or afford to do on its own, for doing audiovisual publishing, which is partly why we set up in the first place. Because I have so many colleagues who are not served at all, let alone well, by conventional publishing.
Not being served well by conventional publishing seems to be a good place to start. It just leaves me a couple things. First of all, just to encourage you to come along on the 9th of March for the next Hive seminar, where Mark Kavanagh and Professor Andy Field will be working with publishers to create popular textbooks. Yeah, right. Everybody wants a popular textbook. And also to say thanks very much for two speakers and for the others. Thank you.